Hey there. Thanks for tuning in. You ready for another episode of my Bigfoot sighting? Alright then, let's do this.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, love's in the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah.
If you'd like to be able to listen to the show without ads and have full access to bonus content, that's an option. To find out how, please go to mybigfootsighting.com.
My Bigfoot sighting started when I was 8 years old, camping in my grandparents' backyard with a cousin. There's a yard light that was in the backyard, and through the tent, we could see the silhouette of something come up and stare over us. We were 8 years old, ran around this backyard all the time. Nobody had ever said anything to us about it. Never once had we ever thought of anything of this nature happening. It was 10 o'clock. We had just gotten to where everybody in the house had calmed down. All the lights had went out, and he and I were up. I mean, we were 8-year-old kids in the backyard. Everybody had gone to sleep, and we were ready to go. And so we were up just talking, goofing, playing, not really doing anything outside the tent, but just staying in the tent, and heard steps come up, and we watched the shadow of this figure just come up to our tent, looked over the tent and turned around and just walked off. When morning came, we spoke with my grandfather and heard him tell my grandmother that they saw a booger, and from that point on, we were not allowed to camp in the backyard ever by ourselves. After dark, we had to be in, no questions asked. So from then, growing up, we moved from South Georgia to North Georgia. I spent a lot of time fishing in the North Georgia mountains. I've had things, pine cones thrown at me, acorns, rocks, tree knocks, yells, all sorts of things go on up in the North Georgia mountains. No physical sightings until the last couple of years, just not knowing what those things were at the time, just thought it was, didn't really think anything of it. I knew what Bigfoot was, but didn't know that Bigfoot was going to be in my life. And turns out that evidently it's been in my life for a while. Tried to just push through stuff, get weird feelings in the woods, and we never had a face-to-face encounter, so I couldn't prove all of these things were Bigfoot, so I never said anything. Then my wife and I got married and took a really long trip across country, and that's where the sightings started happening for us. Coming through Grand Tetons National Park, going into Yellowstone, we had a white one run across the road on us. Then we stayed 2 nights in a cabin in Mount Hood, and one watched me cook dinner. I was grilling out, and it sat about 65 yards away and watched me for about 5-10 minutes, and when I went inside and came back out, it was gone. Then our encounter in Waycross, we went with a group of people looking for it. We were looking to have an encounter. I don't think any of us were ready for the encounter that we had. I know my wife wasn't. This is the one that, without a shadow of a doubt, it solidified everything for me. that what we were dealing with, I'd heard it's a monkey. No, it's too intelligent. It's too intelligent to be a monkey. What happened to us down here, my wife, I'm going to let her tell her side of the event just because she had probably the most creepy aspect of it with the mind speak. We were all sitting around a campfire when all of this happened. So, April.
When I went with John to Waycross, I was going for I like camping and to get away. I was very skeptical about everything, wasn't sure how much I believed in what they were talking about and what they had going on. And when we met up with the two people down in Waycross, I was under the impression that we already had a campsite picked out. And from what I understand, it was, and then something happened, and we had to change. So we went to another park that had campsites, and it was very populated, which I loved. I was wanting to stay there. But they did not want to stay there because they felt like it wasn't going to be secluded enough to have the experience that they were looking for. So we found this campsite that was in the back of the woods. Nobody was back there. And I automatically started having this gut feeling that it was just going to be a very long night. And as we're unpacking, getting the tent up, John and I are putting up our tent. We have one of them pretty decent sized family tents. And I was struggling with the rain fly, and I didn't get it right the first time. And so I asked the other gentleman that was there to help pull it, because John was on the other side holding his side down. And he helped me get it secured so that the rain fly wasn't an issue. And we unpacked everything and just kind of walked around and didn't see anything. It was still daylight out. And as the sun started going down, my nerves just kept getting worse. Like I was under a panic almost. And John pulled out his cameras and his camcorders and was getting things set up. And we started to realize that even though he had charged them fully the night before, they were lacking some battery. So I sat in the car and my phone was charging. His camcorder was charging. And it's starting to get dark. And I'm sitting there, they're not paying any attention to me. And I feel like I'm all alone in the woods because they're behind me and I'm in the car. And I feel like even though they were right behind me, it felt like they were so far away that if something happened, they'd never know. And so I kept looking into the rearview mirror, making sure that I could see them and also trying to keep a lookout of what was going on around me. I finally had enough sitting in the car and panicking. I went and sat with them at the fire, and something kept drawing my attention over to my left into this opening in the woods. And I told John, I said, I really feel like you should take your camera and point it that direction because something is there. I feel it. Something is going on. And we're sitting there and everybody's talking. And one of the other gentlemen that we were with kept seeing the fear that I had. He's like, it's fine. They're not going to bother us. They're not going to hurt us. And then I kept hearing a response in my head that was saying, how do you know that? You don't know that. And started laughing, which really set me off in a panic. Because it's not my voice and these aren't my thoughts. As I'm sitting there trying to not be scared the gentleman has also got night vision and infrared equipment. He's letting me look through it so that I can look through the woods because it is pitch black. You can't see anything. Like when the sun went down, it was gone. There was no light. There was no street lamps. There was nothing. So I'm looking around and I don't see anything. But it doesn't take the fear that I had away. It doesn't calm my nerves. And as I'm staring over into the woods, this light starts shining. And I'm just staring at it like it's almost like it's hypnotizing. And then John looks at me and realizes that I'm no longer listening to whatever they're talking about and wants to know what I'm looking at. He looks over and he sees it. And then everybody else looks over and they're watching it. And everything just started dying. The cameras died. The phones, there was just no battery left on anything. And we weren't exactly in a moment to stop to go start trying to charge it because we were so interested in what was going on around us. And I at first was thinking maybe this is the light of an airplane or something, flying over. But it doesn't fly over and it doesn't move up or down. It starts moving to the side through the wood line. And it's going around us. And then as it gets to where the dirt road is, it goes over into the woods across the street or across the dirt road and it splits. And then there's two. And they're very excited because this is what they came out to look for. However, I am not. And I think probably 4 times I might have said, I'm ready to go. I don't want to do this anymore. And I really kept trying to stick it out because I knew this is something that my husband wanted to do. And I wanted to be supportive. And as I'm sitting there trying to, my legs are shaking. I'm shaking the whole time just because I feel like a target at this point. And we're sitting there and I could feel it would be either behind me or I'd hear noises of something moving in the woods behind me. And I just could not calm down. I was constantly turning around, and once it crossed the dirt road, they caught it on the night vision. And so now there is a sighting. I know how I'm feeling. And I started to get up and decide I was done, but I hadn't hit that point yet. We started hearing howling. Thinking at first it was coyote sounds, but the way that they were ending wasn't exactly like a coyote. It was more drawn out. And probably the scariest part for me was that we're sitting there and they're very, like I said, very excited because this is the most activity I think that anybody has experienced. And then I start hearing this sound of scratching on the tent. And since the tent's made out of a certain material, that it's scratching on the tent. And then that was it for me. I looked at my husband and I told him, I said, you can stay. I'm leaving. I can't do this anymore. And so he knew, he could hear it in my voice that I was in a panic and I wasn't going to stay, and he wasn't going to let me go by myself. And secretly I was hoping that he wouldn't let me go by myself because I was terrified to go down the dirt road alone. So we start packing up and we're doing this very quickly. And the other 2 people that were with us weren't going to go. They were going to stay until they saw eye shine right behind us. It was 4 sets. And then they went into a panic. And so they're all getting their stuff packed up as quickly as possible. And as John and I are taking our tent down, he walks to the back side of it, which probably wasn't very far from where we were sitting. So it was right there next to us, maybe 15 feet. And he looks at me and he says, "The rain fly's been popped on it." And that was the sound that we had heard, or that I had heard. Because as soon as I heard that sound, I shut everything down for me, but they heard growls. But as like I said, we're packing up, he looks at me, he says, "The rain fly's been popped." So now I'm literally picking up things and throwing it in the car because I don't care what kind of condition it's in at this point. I'm just ready to go. And as we're packing up, there's still a lot of noise going on around us. And I shine because, like I said, it's very dark. And it wasn't hard to see. Big red eyes. And then you could also hear footsteps. The dirt road had, when it's quiet out there in the country, you hear everything. And so we could hear footsteps, we could hear trees bending, and it was no secret that they were there, and we knew that they were there. So we're getting in the car where there's 3 vehicles. We are the first vehicles to leave. And then it's the gentleman in his truck behind us, and then the lady, she was the last one behind him. And she's recording the whole time as she's going down the road. And she said, "I don't know if I got it, but there was eye shine all through the woods as we're going down this dirt road." And nobody told me about this. We all met up at a huddle house after we left there. It was the first place in town that was still open. And nobody informed me that when they were walking the perimeter when we first got there, there was a tent that looked like it had just been destroyed, left out in the woods. And I thought there was something else, but I can't remember if they had seen anything else. But I remember the tent specifically. I think it was a sleeping bag. So it was almost like somebody left in a hurry, sort of like we did, but didn't care about their tent to take it with them. And when we get to Huddle House, I hadn't said anything to my husband yet at this point, that the voices that I heard in my head were telling me that we weren't safe and that we needed to go. And I didn't know that was a thing called mind speak until then. We got to the hotel, and as I'm going over everything that had happened, I just started crying because it took a lot out of me, and this is a very scary experience. And I finally fell asleep, and we got up the next morning, and my husband decides that we should go back. And as we're getting to the end of the dirt road, he's looking down at something on his phone. I'm looking up, and I see one run across. It's big enough for one vehicle, dirt road, and it runs across where the outhouses are. And I'm really not interested in staying long, so I don't mention it until after we leave. But as we get out and we start walking around where the fire was and where the tent was, there's footprints that weren't ours. There was one that was 18 inches or better. You could tell that there was movement around where our campsite was. And when we left, I never could shake that feeling of being watched. And it felt like they followed us to our home in Georgia, where we were living at the time. And I would wake up, I'd have dreams But I would wake up, we had a motion sensor that was really hard to set off. And it seemed like it was going off all the time from that point on until we moved. And then since we've been here in Colorado, sometimes I tend to hear things when I go outside. Here recently, actually, I had walked outside to take our dogs out, and I heard what I thought was a motorcycle, but there was, the way that it continued on, it wasn't a motorcycle, and it sort of sounded like one, but it was a growl. So I scooped the dog up. We came back inside pretty quickly. But my daughter, she's 17, she hears things. And she gets those feelings as well, that there's something out there watching her or watching us. She hears heavy breathing sometimes outside of her window, or just like a tapping sound, like a wood knocking sound. And she'll come and wake us up every now and then, but not as much as we would like for her to. But that was our experience with them out in Waycross. And it's not anything that I'm interested in doing again.
The one I saw in Mount Hood while I was grilling out was in between a fork in a tree and was about 60 yards away. What I could see from where I was standing was from about the upper lip up on the head. The head was not conical shaped. It didn't have that traditional, what people describe with the conical shape. This guy had a round head. When I say a round head, this thing was the size of a beach ball. It was huge. Black as black can be. Blackish, kind of a darker charcoal gray skin. I couldn't tell if there were any color to the eyes, being so far away. They just looked black to me. After I saw it and we got done eating the next morning, I walked to where the fork in the tree and the bush is. I could not see the cabin from standing behind the bush in the fork of the tree. I'm 5'11", so probably if I extend my arm up in the air, I can reach 8 foot, and couldn't touch the top of these branches, or the top of this bush rather. So this guy had to be closer to the 9.5, 10 foot tall. This guy was big, guy, girl, whichever. As we were driving through the Grand Tetons, the one that ran across the road from us, or ran across the road in front of us, he was white. My wife keeps referring to him as the Yeti because he's white. He was every bit of 7 foot, 7.5 foot. Looked to be older, just in the way the face looked. It looked like a man. It looked like a 7.5 foot tall, old, white-haired man, just covered in white hair. He shot across the road, ran up the embankment, and spun around behind a tree. All we really saw after passing him was a hand and a shoulder on the tree. That encounter was pretty brief and quick, so not really much detail other than the brief 15 seconds that encounter took, if it took 15 seconds. The ones in Waycross, nobody ever saw other than Eyeshine. The one April saw run across the road, I have to let her describe. Like she said, I was paying attention to something else.
The one that I seen in Waycross as we were turning onto the dirt road was a blur, but it was from where we were. I'm not sure how long that dirt road was, maybe a quarter of a mile. And it cleared the top of the roof of the outhouse. And when I say an outhouse, it's a building that's probably 8-10 feet tall, and it stood taller than that, and it was fast. I hadn't seen any. Like I said, it was a blur. It moved so quickly that if I hadn't looked up, I wouldn't have seen it. It was so incredibly fast. But it was brown in color and tall, and that's about the only description I have of the one that I seen as we were turning onto the road.
My Bigfoot sightings have all been in the eastern Panhandle of West Virginia, not more than an hour and a half from Baltimore, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. As a kid, growing up in this area, I love the outdoors, I love to hunt and fish. My grandpap and my uncle are the ones that taught me how to do all that. They ran a trap line, and we trapped red foxes, gray foxes, raccoons, possums, skunks, whatever would get in our traps. We would trap those animals, and then we would sell the furs to the local fur trader. And my first experience with something out of the ordinary was on one of these trap lines where we would use the intestines of the hogs that we would butcher, and we would use those to bait the traps with. It seemed to work a whole lot better than a can of sardines. And on this trap line, we had at least 6 or 7 traps in a row down this well-used game trail. And we baited them all. And my grandpap had, his ways about him. He would cover the trap with wax paper, and he would put a cover scent on it, and then he would sprinkle a little dirt over top of the wax paper, hang the bait over top the trap, and then come back the next morning and check it. Well, as we made our way down the game trail and we came to the first trap, discovered that this thing had been torn completely apart. And something had just completely destroyed this thing. And if you're familiar with these types of traps, they're made out of pretty heavy steel, and a normal person could not tear this thing apart. And there shouldn't be any animals roaming this part of West Virginia that should be able to tear one of these traps apart. And it's interesting because this occurred in the mid-'70s. So back then, this area was nowhere near as developed as it is now. Now, where all the farms and woodlands and fields and whatnot were, you have housing developments that have anywhere between 75 and 150 houses in each one, sometimes more. So definitely the habitat for anything has decreased over the years. So we get to the first trap. We inspect what happened. We don't notice anything. And of course, at the time, I'm only 7 years old, maybe 8 years old. I don't know what's going on. And I see my grandpap and my uncle having a discussion a little bit of ways from me. And then, of course, Pap takes another trap out of his bag, resets it, rebaits it, does everything, moves to the next one. Well, we get to the next one in line. The same thing's happened to that. It's been completely torn apart. Metal parts everywhere, springs, you name it. It's been pulled off the tree. Now you start to see a look of concern on their face, but like I said, at 7 or 8 years old, you don't pay attention to that. And we move to the next one. And same thing. Needless to say, all the traps in that trap line had the same thing happen to them. Bait's gone, traps destroyed. Everything had to be replaced. So, like I said, at 7 or 8 years old, I didn't pay much attention to the circumstances surrounding everything. And I never, and Bigfoot and Sasquatch never crossed my mind at that age, because I don't think any of us knew what that was back then in the mid-'70s, especially in this part of West Virginia. But it wasn't long after that. Like, I noticed that grandpap always carried a small Ruger single 6.22 revolver to dispatch everything that he had caught in the traps. And from there on out, you know, it was the single 6, but then he would also carry his shotgun with slugs in it. And then my uncle would carry his 7mm mag, and they always told me to stay close by. So did they know something? Did they know something I didn't know? Maybe. But I do know after that, it wasn't long after that, that the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek came out, and we did go to the local movie theater to watch that movie. So many years later, looking back, that was a giveaway maybe to what maybe they knew. Fast forward about a year, we had a farm that bordered this property. And grandpap always had maybe 15 to 20 head of cattle, and he always kept 10 or 12 head of hogs in the hog lot there, right around the barn. And we had to go over and feed the animals one morning. So he let me out at the barn and told me to go get hay and put out for the cows, whatnot, behind the barn. And then he was going to go feed the hogs. Well, he wasn't gone long. He came back and he was in the truck, and he told me, he said, "Boy, you got to get in the truck now. We got to go back to the house." And I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "Don't worry about it. We just got to go back to the house." So I stopped doing what I was doing, and we shut the gate, and out of there we went. We went back to the house, and I noticed grandpap on the phone, and he was talking to someone. He was like explaining what had happened, and what had happened was something had gotten into our hog pen and pretty much mutilated 10 or 12 hogs, killed them all, and kind of like laid their bellies open. I didn't know any of this until we went back over and we met the deputy sheriff, and we met the Department of Natural Resources officer. Of course, they did their investigation, and they came to the conclusion that a bobcat did it. Now, I know, and you know, and everyone else out there knows that a bobcat doesn't stand a chance against 10 or 12 head of hogs in a pen. It might throw a scratch on something here or there, but more than likely 10 or 12 head of hogs are going to kill a bobcat. So after they did their investigation and said that there was nothing that they can do and that the bobcat did it, we took all the carcasses out of the pen and we drug them down in the field and let the foxes and raccoons and possums have them. And many years later, with the invention of the internet, I went back and I looked, and I seen where all this stuff found all kinds of similar incidences to what happened to me over the years and what I've experienced. And it's just absolutely amazing, the coincidences and the similarities to everything that happened over the years. I mean, as it went on, it wasn't but a couple years later that my grandpap passed away. And like I said at the beginning, I had a fondness for fishing and hunting, and he was my best friend, and he pretty much took me everywhere I wanted to go, as far as out in the woods or along the stream or the river or whatever, you know. And at that point, at 9 years old, just turning 10 years old, I had to start doing all that by myself. And my grandmother, God bless her, she trusted me enough at 9 and 10 years old to go out in the woods by myself or go along the streams by myself, and to actually go out and continue to do what I love to do. And it was during those times that I would have rocks thrown at me while I was fishing, or I'd have rocks thrown at me while I was hunting, or I would see things darting between the trees at a distance, maybe 80 to 100 yards away, and not knowing what they were, and just thinking maybe, oh, it's a deer or a turkey, but too big to be a deer or a turkey. And like I said, it wasn't until many, many, many years later with the invention of the internet that I went through and it just gave me cold chills when I started reading all that stuff, that I've had all this happen to me and this is what it possibly could have been. And it's mind blowing. And like I said, it happened for the longest time when I lived in that little neighborhood right outside of Martinsburg, West Virginia. Nowadays, you never know that something like that was possible to happen there. But back in the late 70s and all through the 80s and into the mid 90s, before the population boom hit here, all kinds of strange things happened. Between the rock throwing and the noises that you would hear, and then the actual sightings. The first sighting that I vividly remember was we were deer hunting, and we were deer hunting in basically the same place where the traps got destroyed. And we were driving deer, and this thing come running down the side of this hill, and it was the same color as a deer. It was on all fours, but it looked like it had a really shaggy coat. No way it could have been a bear. No way. And because it was the color of a deer and because we were deer hunting, it's a deer. So we fired on this thing. And I mean, we had drivers on top of that hill. They went and looked. We went and looked. But yet, whatever this was, we couldn't find it. We couldn't find a blood trail. It never came down off of that hill to the standards on any side because we had this hill surrounded. We had a road to the backside of that hill. We had a guy walking there. We had two guys at the very end of it to where if something ran off, it would run right to them. And then we had me and my next door neighbor walking the road on the other side of the hill. And that's where we seen it at, and that's where we fired on it, because we thought it was a deer. No facial features, no nothing like that. It was just so fast, and it happened so quick that that's what it was. And then later on that week, we were driving deer again, and we had rocks the size of softballs thrown at us. We were driving deer, I guess, from north to south, and where we were standing at, to the west of us, there was real thick woods, and that's where the rocks came from. They would come out and land in the road right by our feet. And the guy that I was standing with blamed his son for throwing the rocks at us. Pete, quit throwing rocks. And I told him, I said, it's not Pete. Pete's coming out ahead of us. Pete can't be to the side of us. And 10 minutes later, Pete came out in front of us. So it's definitely something that I can't explain. And there was no one else in there besides us. We were the only ones that had permission to hunt that property. I've had limbs snapped. Same place. Me and a friend rabbit hunting. And we're standing there and we're gathering our thoughts. And we're talking for a second, discussing our next move, what we wanted to do. And then we hear this loud snap. And of course, we both look at each other and it's like, what was that? And then I walk down in the woods and I see a limb on a pine tree that's as big around as my arm snapped off. And it snapped off at least 10 or 12 feet off the ground. And, at that point, it's like we dropped the shot shells out of our shotguns that we were rabbit hunting with and threw a handful of slugs in the shotguns and was like, what are we dealing with here? Because we didn't hear no thunder or lightning. We knew lightning didn't knock that limb off that tree. But back then, once again, we're not thinking Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Not until many years later, once again, nothing dawned on me. And then there were times where never any smells really. Only maybe once or twice did we catch an odor of something that was close by, but never when something happened like that. It was never something that happened. And then one of my better sightings Same neighborhood, we had an open field in behind our house that we used to play baseball and football in. And one of the neighbors had fenced it in at that point and had a horse and a donkey and who knows what else running in the field. And I happened to be looking out my kitchen window, and whatever this was like squatted down like a back catcher in a baseball game. And as I'm watching it out the window, this thing just stands up, turns hard to its right, and just strides off. And this thing has to be 8 to 10 feet tall, just huge, dark colored. And at that point, my son, who was just small at the time, was out in the yard playing with the dog, and I come flying out the door. I ran past him and I told him, I said, just get in the house, just go in the house. So he goes in the house and I run through the neighbor's yard, go up and start heading down the road to look to see what this thing was or where it went, and it disappears. It's like it just walked off and stepped over that barbed wire fence, was 3 strands high, and into the woods and gone. Just things like that all the time. That little neighborhood had just this weird vibe about it. You would be walking through the woods and you would find where the vegetation had grown so thick that it had grown over and it looked like almost a dome shape. And you could walk through those things. There was just like really pronounced game trails that ran through there. And it could have been deer. It could have been anything. But I know now that that's probably where these things were hanging out at in inclement weather. And because every once in a while, you would find the carcass of a deer or some type of animal that had been drugged underneath there. Back when you're a kid, you just don't realize that a fox won't do that. Not something that big. And always made me kind of curious, but then I'd always, as soon as I'd get into something like that, I'd get out of it pretty quick because you just always had that weird feeling. The hair would stand up on your neck. The hair would stand up on your arms. And you just wanted to get out. But there were just miles and miles and miles and miles of like farmland and woods and everything intersected with each other. And there was just so much territory there that you could have hid anything. And in some instances, you still can. Some of that property will never be developed for whatever reason. It's sat vacant for years and years and years, and it's just posted property now, so no one can go in there and do any type of investigation and look around and see what's going on. That's my goal, is to find out who I could talk to get into some of these places, to go in and take a look around and see what I could find. It would be good to go back and revisit my childhood and see if these things are still there, and if they are, how they're adapting to all the development around them. Like I said earlier, we went from being a area that was pretty remote, had a lot of farms, orchards. Now it's all housing developments because all the people from the Baltimore, D.C. areas moved into here because it's cheaper to live here and buy a house here and raise a family here. And then as I get older and I start to have a family and this, that, and the other, I don't tend to spend as much time in the woods as I used to. And there at one point, I found myself on the verge of homelessness and moved in with my parents, me and my son. And of course, I instilled in my son, and of course my ex-father-in-law and my uncle and whoever else, we all instilled in my son the love of hunting and fishing. And my son, even when he was younger, I told him, I said, I was trusted enough to go out in the woods by myself when I was 9, 10 years old. I'm going to trust you because I can't be home all the time. I've got to work. He come running back into my mom and dad's house one night, and he was just yelling, "Dad, Dad, Dad, look what I found." he found this clump of hair that was on the side of a tree, probably 8 or 9 feet off the ground. And these hairs were multicolored. So if you can picture the multicolors in a ghillie suit, that's what this hair kind of looked like. Red, gray, black, white, all different colors. We did everything we could do to not touch it when we took it off the tree, and he come back and he had it in a Ziploc bag. And I actually contacted a few folks about who I could send it to possibly find out what this hair was. And I ended up getting the name and address of Dr. Melba Ketchum down in Texas. And I actually sent some of that stuff to her. And I'm hoping that it was part of the Sasquatch Genome Project. But I'll never know for sure because I never got an answer back as to whether it was legit or whether it was just something totally different. And that property at my mom and dad's house is always just a weird vibe when you're in the woods hunting or even sitting out on the porch. I mean, I've had something in the woods whistle, and the whistle was just, and I would try to mimic that and whistle back. And then it would just go back and forth. It would repeat itself, and then I would whistle back. It would whistle. I would whistle, and then I decided to change it up, and I went, and it did the same thing back to me. And then it was at that point where I was like, well, you know what? Could it be a person down there? Possibly, but at this time of night and as thick as those woods are, I highly doubt that it was a person. I've seen eye shine. I know at least 8, 10, 12 feet off the ground. I had someone ask me, could it have been an owl? Possibly. And then I go down and look, and at that height off the ground, there's no limbs that would have supported an owl to even sit in. And the V in the tree is where the eyes were visible at, and just different growls and all kinds of different vocalizations come out of those woods. And then we have a wildlife management area here on the border of Berkeley and Morgan counties here in the eastern Panhandle of West Virginia. And I found some very, very, very interesting things that can only point to one thing. I've had instances happen there where I've had something like circle me while I was deer hunting, and it made a sound to where it sounded like a crow, but it was too deep and too guttural to be an actual crow making the noise. And it went from the 6 o'clock position to the 9 o'clock position to the 12 o'clock position, and it got behind me. And once again, the hair stands up on your neck, and you get this overwhelming sense of dread. Everything's dead quiet in the mountain. No wind, no birds, no nothing. It's time to go. And in the same area, I've found stick structures. I have found footprints. And it just leads me to believe that it's one thing and one thing only. And then maybe about 2 miles on up the road, there's another service road that cuts across the top of the mountain right on the Berkeley-Morgan County line. You know, I had a sighting there. I found stick structures there. I had a rock thrown at me there. The sighting I had there was right after the rock was thrown. You know, I'm looking, thinking that there's a squirrel in the tree, and a nut falls and hits the ground, and come to find out, I see a rock the size of a baseball laying on top of the leaves. And as I glance down through the mountain, I see something dart from a tree in behind this rock outcropping. People have a hard time believing that there are Bigfoot, in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, but there are plenty of remote areas that too many acres for these things to hide. There's 23,000 acres in the wildlife management area. And then there are just like hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of private acres that are all wooded that border it on either side of the mountain, and plenty of places for something like this to hide. And that's pretty much the reason why I've kind of like limited my hunting and fishing and whatnot anymore over the years. Unless I can find someone to tag along with me and go out in the woods with someone and not by myself, I don't even buy a hunting license anymore. I don't buy a fishing license anymore. I just don't want to have to go out and deal with something like that, especially when I'm by myself. I mean, it's gotten to the point where when I do hunt, I used to hunt exclusively with a .243 Winchester. And that thing only shoots a 100 grain bullet, which is plenty enough for a deer. Plenty. But after whatever it was circled me and was making those noises, I immediately went out and got me a whole lot bigger gun. I got me a 35 Wheeling, and I shoot 225 grain bullets through that thing. So that'll pretty much stop whatever walks God's green earth. And I still don't go out in the woods much anymore. Like I said, I don't need to encounter something like that by myself. That's just not a good thing. Too many people come up missing. I'm sure everyone's seen the missing 411 videos, and especially the one about the hunters. I don't need to be a statistic. I still do go out there every once in a while. I'll gather a group of friends and we'll go out and explore, and we'll find things, and we'll have rational discussions. And if we find something that resembles a stick structure, we will pick it apart. Could this have been a person? Could this have been kids that done this? Could this have been adults that done this? Could it be this? Could it be that? And all bets are off if you know what done it, if you find some type of tracks around it. And sometimes we do. It can only be one thing. And people just need to understand when they go out in the woods, be careful. And always look over your shoulder. And always carry enough gun. And make sure you let everyone in your family know where you're going and who you're going with. And don't vary from that. Don't stray from that. And things should be okay.
Well, that's it for tonight's show. If you've had a Bigfoot sighting and would like to be a guest, please go to mybigfootsighting.com and let us know. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, loves and the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah, the sound of a memory brings me back to the bluegrass playing on my dad's 8-track. It's pick a man had been through it, getting through the day on Scruggs and Skags, booking hay bales to those Tennessee jams. There's no other way that I do it. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah. Somebody call it backwards and double time, looking at the soul and the drumming on Kentucky style. Those are the anthems drumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. by, with the bass on the stereos booming. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah. Something going backwards in double time, getting in the soul and the tremolo Kentucky style. Those are the anthems drumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Something going backwards in double time, getting in the soul and the tremolo Kentucky style. Those are the anthems drumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm, ride chicken porch swing, mama's best sweet tea kind of sound.